All right. Hello, this is Christian Idealism. So today I'm going to be responding to, well, myself. um, as you all know, I did a debate against Emerson Green, I think about 4 weeks ago now. Um, and I presented, of course, a case for atheism, right? So my sort of brief case for atheism. So in this video today, we're going to go over my case, and I'm going to show some of the problems with my own arguments that I made. Keep in mind, I don't think any of the arguments that I used actually go through, and so I'm going to go over the reasons why I think that today. And we're going to be going over a lot of stuff, so this isn't going to be your quick stream. Like, I'm not just going to, try to respond to very briefly. No, we're going to try to go into detail and look into the literature on because there's a lot that could be said on this. And so that's what we're going to be doing today, is looking into that. So with that in mind, let's get started with my opening statement, and then I'll respond to each point that I make in the video. All right. Thanks, Emerson, for that presentation. Hopefully in the dialogue we can go back and forth on those sort of points. But here I want to present my case for atheism. So I'm going to define naturalism in the broadest sense that I can and compare it with theism. So I define theism as the hypothesis of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good being. So theism is a broad category. So we're not going to have time to go over any specific version of theism. What I mean by theism, I just mean perfect being theism, right? And then for naturalism, I would define naturalism as natural reality exhausts causal reality, nothing but natural entities and natural causes in a causally closed system. So naturalism is a broad category, right? And so typically naturalism is compatible with many different views about the philosophy of mind, about about morality, about consciousness, all that stuff, right? And so naturalism is not materialism, so this allows naturalism to sort of be much wider than many people think it is, right? And typically naturalism is paired with the hypothesis of indifference, and according to the hypothesis of indifference, there is no link between the properties of nature and the properties of value. Sorry, I had to stop myself because I'm just going to try to skip to where I actually start to make arguments, because I don't want to, because I do go over a lot of once theory, how, once theory prior to arguments. I agree with most, at least I agree with the first, let's say 2 minutes of what I have to say. And then I'll get into the arguments specifically. So I'll start off where I think, I'll just start off there, and then I'll respond to what I have to say. Hold on. Right, between the theists and the atheists, right? And so because of this problem, this leads to my sort of methodology, which is that you want to minimize commitments and maximize explanation. So when we assess theism and naturalism, we should assess them in terms of our comparative worldviews. We want to minimize commitments through simplicity and maximize explanation through explanatory power. And so a worldview, I define a worldview as everything you hold to be a non-derivable belief or an axiom. I can get more on discussion that later. Basically, an axiom is any non-derivable belief. So, like for example, my belief in cats or dogs are gonna be non-derivable because I can't really entail them from my prior beliefs about the world, right? And so, in this case, data would be what two comparative worldviews share, right? Now, in terms of simplicity, there are sort of three considerations here. There is ontological, ideological, and theoretical. So on the theoretical dimension, we assess the complexity of the axiomatization itself. This is the function of both the number and complexity of the axioms, right? All right, so I need to stop myself right there because this is where problems start to immediately, you immediately run into problems, right? Now, keep in mind here that the comparative assessment that I used for this debate was Graham Oppy's assessment of worldviews. So how he does it and the way that I present it here, where we're looking at worldviews, so everything you believe. So it's not just your theory of it's not just your metaphysics. It's literally pretty much everything you believe about the world. And you compare it by your axioms, right? Or the non-derivable beliefs of your worldview. Well, the problem there is that's one way to do it, but there's also other ways you could do theory comparison that doesn't require you to look at it this sort of way, right? And typically in the philosophy of science, this is this is not how we do worldview comparison, or at least this is not how we do theory comparison. We don't look at worldviews, right? Because a worldview is everything you believe, okay? But a worldview is not a theory, right? I mean, my belief about cats or dogs or whatever is irrelevant to, when we're doing scientific practice. It's irrelevant to what scientific theories say, right? So when we're comparing scientific theories, we don't say, oh, well, I believe in this and that. No, we have to compare the theories, not the worldviews, right? And this is important because when we're talking about theories, we're not just talking, at that point, when we're talking about theories, a theory is more limited, which means it's more compressed, right? What does that mean? Well, what it means is that we're not going to be talking about what I believe, but rather we're going to be talking about the content of my theory, right? And I think this is where, this is where I would, of course, differ with Oppie, but I would also respond to my alter ego self, which is that this is just the wrong way to do worldview comparison, or at least when we're trying to compare theism and naturalism, this is just the wrong way to do it, right? So, okay, if this is the wrong way to do it, then how should we do it? Well, how we should do it is we should compare the theories by their metaphysics, right? So we should compare the theories of theism and naturalism by their metaphysical commitments and not by how many beliefs the person actually has, right? And this is important for very different reasons, because theism is a metaphysical theory that it makes specific, or not specific predictions, but it makes general predictions about, what we observe. And I'll get more into that later. But there's a lot of problems, at least with how this is framed. So from the very beginning, I would question the methodology that that I'm using to make these sort of comparisons, right? And so I just want to point that out. That's the first problem that I have with this sort of argument. Is it's not only that of course, I think that theism is simpler than naturalism, but when we're doing comparisons, we have to compare the theories. We're not comparing the worldviews. So a worldview is everything you believe, but we're not comparing worldviews. We're comparing a theory, and a theory is a subset of worldview, not vice versa, right? And so I think the problem here is that when Oppie or when myself, when we compare these worldviews, what we're trying to say is that, we're treating a worldview as a theory, when really it should be, or I think it's the reverse. I'm not totally sure. I forgot the exact way to look at it, but basically, at least how I look at it, is a theory is a subset of a worldview, right? So we should compare the theories, right? And the worldview is pretty much irrelevant. So anything else that's not part of my theory is going to be irrelevant to um, the theory, right? Or in this case, the theory of theism, right? And so my first response would be, no, this is not how we should do comparison, right? I think when we do comparison, I think it gets really interesting. If you look at Joshua Shijiwadi's paper on this, he compares theism and naturalism in terms of quantitative and qualitative simplicity, but he's actually looking at them through their fundamental commitments and not by the axiomatization of the worldviews, right? And it gets a little more complicated there, because once we start doing that sort of comparison, then theism is going to have the advantage in many different respects. Now, if you don't believe me on this, I will stop sharing my screen, and I'll share a new screen with you guys, just so that I can understand, so people can sort of understand where I'm coming from when it comes to this. Let me see. I think this is it. I just want to make sure everyone can see it. So this is from the book. I forgot the exact. Hold on. Let me see if I can find the exact title of this book. It's a book in the philosophy of science. And I don't want to go back up. I'll be right. Let me see if I can find the exact. Okay, Simplicity, Inference, and Modeling. And it's edited by, let me just double check real quick. I'm trying to make sure I cite my sources properly. So it's edited by Arnold Zanger, who I can't pronounce their names. Anyways, so so this is chapter 5 of that book, right? Within the philosophy of science literature, and when it comes to simplicity, how we look at simplicity is through your fundamental commitments, right? And again, this is just one paper. There's plenty of others papers on simplicity that I could reference here. But the first, I guess, issue here is that when we're talking about simplicity, we have to realize that we're talking about fundamental commitments of your theory, and not the axiomatization of your worldview, right? And so I think this is pretty consistent within the philosophy of science. So in the philosophy of science, I mean, we got to realize that science is not looking at worldviews. Science is looking at specific theories, and I think we should do the same thing with theism and naturalism. We should look at theories and not worldviews, right? If we define theory as just a systematic way, or at least a metaphysical way of looking at the world, then it would just seem, to me at least, that this is how we should do it, right? Now, let me see if I can find where exactly he talks about the type of simplicity that I sort of support. Let's see here. Unfortunately, this is never. This is not probably. This is probably a really bad way of trying to prove the point. But okay, here we go. Where is it? Da-na-na. Okay, let me see here. I can't find. Okay, so basically, okay, let me try to summarize what it's trying to say here, because I don't want it to. I don't want people to, you know, it to over people's heads. But basically, the idea here is that when we're doing worldview comparison, right? Let me stop sharing real quick. So when we're doing worldview comparison, we want to make sure that we talk about simplicity as a function of the fundamental commitments of your theory, right? So it's not about worldview. So it's not about your axioms. Rather, it's about the theory of theism, right? So on theism, I mean, Swinburne, he argues that God has two properties. I think it's all powerful and or omniscient. I can't remember the exact properties, but basically, Swinburne argues that God has two fundamental properties. Joshua Shijuwadi argues that God has no properties and only one sort of entity, or at least one sort of he calls it a trope, which basically means a trope is something that has no properties, so it's one entity and zero properties, right? And when you look at it through that sort of lens, then you're going to run into a situation where, okay, if theism says that there's one entity with zero properties, then what does naturalism say? Well, on naturalism, there's two ways you can go at it. Either one, you go a priority pluralist view, where you're going to have multiple entities with, I think it's multiple entities with one property. I can't remember. And then the priority pluralist, or not the pluralist, but the monist view, which is you have one entity with many properties, or at least many. I think it calls it qualitative. You're going to have qualitative complexity, right? And so right here, I mean, when we're doing this sort of comparison, this is going to be problematic for Oppie's, at least this view of how we do comparison, right? And what I mean by this is just the way that I did it in the opening statement, right? And so there you run into that problem. Now, the final problem, and because I don't want to spend too much time on this, because there's other arguments I want to get into, but the final problem is what I call the top-down versus bottom-up view or approach. So the way that I do it here is the top-down sort of perspective, where you look at the total worldview, you look at the total beliefs of your worldview, and then you point out, okay, what are the non-derivable beliefs in that worldview, and then we count those, and then that's how we look at simplicity, and then from there, then we can then sort of derive entailments and stuff. The problem is that if you do this, you're not going to be able to make any sort of probabilistic judgments about anything, right? Literally everything's going to be deductive, right? This is basically what I think Oppie's views run into, where literally everything about your worldview is going to be deductive. So you're not going to be able to make any sort of probabilistic judgments if you're going to do a sort of top-down worldview comparison. Whereas if you do a bottom-up comparison, it gets a little more interesting because then you can do probabilistic judgments. So you start off with, again, positing your fundamental entity, right, through the information theoretical account of simplicity. And then you can see, okay, well, then what is most probably the case given that that probabilistic judgment, right? And then another thing is that when you do the bottom up sort of approach, that's actually more consistent with the philosophy of science, given that in science we have to more often than not we're going to have to posit some unobservable entity to explain what we do observe, right? And this is general scientific practice, right? Is a sort of bottom up view, and this is again this is how Swinburne looks at it. This is how Trent Dowdery looks at it. This is how Joshua Sujawadi looks at it. So there, and then of course atheist philosophers such as Schaffer, I think it's Jonathan Schaffer, looks at it through this sort of lens as well, right? And so right then and there, at least those are the problems that you're going to run into, is that the way that at least this version of Kyle that I'm responding to, of course myself, but the problem with this argument is that it's just fundamentally just the wrong way to look at things. So it's just fundamentally the wrong methodology, basically. And this is, of course, why I don't think it even gets off the ground, because it's not even a view that you're going to find in the philosophy of science, right? So when you go into the philosophy of science and you look at the different views of simplicity, you're not going to find this axiomatization view where you look at the worldview, or you look at the total worldview of somebody, and then you make deductions, or you make logical entailments from there to then decide, okay, which view is simpler, which view is not, right? And this is the reason why I would just immediately push back, right? So before we can even talk about which view is better, theism or naturalism, we're going to have to talk about methodology before we even start to discuss this. And of course, I would just disagree with the way that myself has presented this. So that's the first problem with this argument. And of course, this will have implications for what I have to say next, because if the methodology doesn't work, then anything else that I say after that is pretty much irrelevant, right? So let's continue on with what I have to say. So that's theoretical. On ideological, we consider the complexity of the lexicon. This is a function of the number and complexity of undefined terms within the axiomatization. And again, what I mean by an axiom is just anything you hold to be non-derivable, right? So I'm talking about just a worldview here. And then on the ontological dimension, we consider the complexity in domains over which the quantifiers of your axiomatization range. This takes into account both the numbers and kinds of objects in your worldview. So I would argue that naturalism on this sort of worldview comparative account is simpler than theism. All right, so again, I have to stop myself because this is just the wrong way to do it. Just flat out. This is just the wrong way to look at simplicity. Now, when it comes to these more specific objections, especially on this slide right here, let me see if I can make that bigger. But okay, so this is where it becomes interesting. So for naturalism, there was initial state, laws, outcomes of chancey events. Okay, the problem there is that you're basing everything. You're not making any sort of you're not making any sort of probabilistic judgments on that, right? So the moment that you do that, you're going to run into problems because everything's deductive. You can't make any Bayesian analysis of anything, right? Because the thing is, like, okay, yeah, they both share the worldview, but we're doing probabilistic judgments. So we're doing a bottom-up comparison. We're not doing a top-down comparison, right? So this argument, or at least this way of looking at it, is just completely wrong, right? And this is why none of the at least none of the simplicity arguments work, because it's just the wrong way to look at it. So let me continue. Theism, right? So I would say that naturalism has a slight advantage over a theistic worldview when it comes to theoretical simplicity, since claims about what God has do not feature among the claims that it makes. For naturalism, there can be, again, this is just a toy model, so I don't want to get too much into detail here. But number one, you could say on naturalism, there's initial state, there's laws, and then there's outcomes of chancy events. For theism, God wants the initial state, God wants the laws, and God wants the. Okay, so again, this is where the problems come in. Yeah, God wants this or that, but we're looking at what does theism actually predict. If God is, again, I'll get more into theism's predictions later, especially when we talk about the explanatory power of theism, because I do make some objections to that later. So I don't want to spend too much time on that right now. But when we're talking about God wants this or that, okay, yeah, but we're still appealing to goodness, so we're still making a probabilistic judgment, right? I mean, yeah, it's true that you're going to have to make some sort of assumptions about what God wants, right, to make this sort of argument. But that's irrelevant because we're doing a probabilistic judgment, right? So this sort of way of looking at it, I mean, what more likely is it on naturalism that you're going to expect this? I mean, it's just the problem is the entire system. So the entire way of looking at it through this top-down sort of view is because it's deductive, you can't make any probabilistic judgments, which means it's just gonna completely you're gonna make wrong inferences basically, because this is not how we do it in science. So, anyways, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but let's continue on with what I have to say next. These chancy events, right? But the problem here is that the choices that God makes, of course, ideological simplicity. So I would say that naturalism has a big advantage in terms of ideological commitments, as the vocabulary that you use to describe God, as well as the rest of your worldview, is going to be more complex than the vocabulary used to describe the natural world. So I'm gonna.
Sorry about the technical difficulties, everybody.
So this is where I came out. I'm gonna skip this. Hold on. It says my connection is unstable on my end. Let me see if I can skip to. All right. Okay, we're good now. I just want to make sure. I'm gonna skip this because I've already explained the problems with this argument. But I'll just. There are going to be additional ontological commitments, right, in your worldview, right? And so in that case, there's going to be more baggage there, right? So now let's get into background knowledge, right? So Sobel, in response to Swinburne, says that Hume, Mackey, and I find evidence against the prior probability of theism when we think about the barely comprehensible nature or barely comprehensible character of an infinitely powerful and knowledgeable perfectly being, right? And so the point here is that this is just inconsistent with our background knowledge, right? And so as Mackey rightly points out, we should have to, point here is that there's just nothing in our experience that really tells us that there's going to be a being like this, right? Everything in our background knowledge tells us that intentional beings that have intentions, are embodied, are limited, right? We don't have background knowledge that they're unlimited in that sort of respect, right? So given that theism loses on background knowledge and simplicity, then I would argue that it has a low prior probability, right? Okay, sorry, I muted myself. So this is the background knowledge argument. I quoted both Mackey and Sobel. I think, J.H. Sobel. I can't remember the exact first name, but anyways, so this is an interesting argument that I made because Mackey makes it a lot in his book on the miracle of theism, and of course Sobel sort of follows Mackey and I think Hume and some others on this. So the problem is that there's two ways that I could respond to this, right? So the first way is to simply just deny that background knowledge is relevant for when we do theory comparison. That's the way that Swinburne does it. That's the way that I used to take when responding to this argument. But honestly, I think there are some issues with that, and so the way that I approach it is that we have to look at the background knowledge of theism in light of the background metaphysics that we're using. What does that mean? Well, there's different ways you can cash this out, but one way to cash this out, and this is what Joshua Shijiwadi sort of cashed it out in his article, which was basic, or I think his paper, which was that when it comes to background knowledge, we have to look at it in terms, or the theism, we have to look at it in terms of tropes, right? So if God is a trope, if God is a metaphysically omnipotent trope, then we have to look at it in terms of trope theory, right? And of course, metaphysicians, of course, talk about trope theory, right, in their metaphysics, right? And then, of course, I also want to mention that trope theory is a categoryless ontology, which means that it's consistent with idealism, physicalism, dualism, or any sort of, at least, ontological view that you hold to, right? I don't want to get too much in details on that, but basically, if you hold to a categoryless ontology, or if your view of theism is categoryless, right, and if you say that, okay, God is just a trope, right, then this argument doesn't even get off the ground, because God is not gonna be an immaterial mind, or at least not in this. God's not gonna be this sort of ontology that Mackey or Sobel or Hume think of, right? If God is a trope, and if we're using trope metaphysics, then your background knowledge is going to be that trope metaphysics, right? That is it. That's all that you need, right? And then when you apply that, so when you have a trope theoretic account of theism, right, then all that you need for background knowledge is going to be the trope metaphysics, and that's it, right? There's nothing else that you need to appeal to. You don't need to talk about God as an immaterial mind or a material mind. Like, you don't need any of that, right? And this is where this is, I guess, the fundamental problem with this sort of argument, is that it is assuming. I just want to zoom. I don't know if it looks like I have weak connection again, but hopefully, hopefully I don't. Okay, hopefully I don't get out. Let me check real quick. I just want to make sure that this is going well. I'll be right. Give me like one moment. I'll be right back. All right, we're good. I had to just check my own stream and see if it was working. Anyways, so this is the problem with the argument. Okay, what's the problem with this argument? The simple problem is looking at background knowledge the wrong way. If background knowledge is a trope theoretic account, as Joshua Shijiwadi would argue, this argument doesn't get off the ground, basically. So again, it goes back to that whole idea that this is just fundamentally the wrong way to look at it, right? And so if you're using the wrong methodology to look at this, then your arguments are not going to work. And this is the problem. This is the problem with this argument, right? Is that it's just fundamentally just the wrong way to look at background knowledge, right? So with that in mind, then, that's the first two arguments that I presented in my debate. So, of course, simplicity and background knowledge. Again, the problem with these arguments is that they are using a methodology that does not exist in the philosophy of science. Again, I have tried to find any sort of view of simplicity that sort of matches with Oppie's or the way that I presented it in this debate. I have not found it. Every single view of simplicity that I've found in the literature has been Swinburne's view or something close to it. Okay. And this is the problem, is that if your view of simplicity does not exist in the philosophy of science, then I shouldn't take it seriously, right? And so the problem with this argument that I'm making here is that if my view of simplicity does not exist in the philosophy of science, it doesn't matter. It doesn't get off the ground, okay? And of course, if my way of looking at background knowledge is also wrong, then the argument doesn't get off the ground. So with that in mind, then we have to, of course, continue on with my next few arguments, and that's what we're going to be doing now. So to overcome this low prior probability, we would need really good evidence to overcome this initial low prior, right? So that's basically my argument in a nutshell. Now, I would also think this is a more important point, which is that theism generally has bad explanatory power. Well, what does that mean? Well, the point here is that God's actions are really almost never a good explanation for anything, because God's actions has literally infinite degrees of freedom and virtually no limitations. Thus, it is easily consistent with any possible occurrence, and hence it is unable to explain why any outcome pertains over any other possible outcome. All right, I gotta stop myself right there. So the first point is just false, right? God's actions do not have infinite degrees of freedom because God is all good, right? If God is all good, then by definition, he cannot do any bad action. Okay. If he cannot do any bad action, then he's going to have a limited range of actions to do, right? So this first point here is just completely false, right? It is not true that that we cannot assess between different possible occurrences, right? Because if we're talking about God's goodness, then that's going to limit the range of actions or things that God would do, right? Now, of course, we can debate about what God would do, but that's not the point. The point is that at least the first point here that I made is just false, right? So I just want to point that out here. Now, what about the second point? And I'll get more into this in a moment, but I'm gonna let myself speak on this. And so the point here is that we cannot test any theistic explanation since they all lack a specification of a particular goal. If there is a particular phenomena that theism needs to explain, such as fine-tuning, the universe, consciousness, etc., then we need to know God's intentions for creating such things if theism is to serve as an explanation at all. However, the point here is that... All right, I gotta stop myself right there again. So this whole idea that we need a specific particular goal in order to explain why God would create one specific thing over another is irrelevant to theism. And there's a good reason for this. The reason why this is the case, right? And I will get more. I don't want to get too much in details here on this, but because I'm going to do a whole video on this. But basically, if God is all good, then he would only do good actions. And so, by definition, he will create good things. If God will create good things, right, then we don't need to say that, oh, well, we need this specific intention to explain this particular phenomena. All you have to do, all you have to do is link that specific thing. You have to identify the thing. Then we identify, okay, what is it within this thing that has goodness? And from there, then we can say, okay, this is the reason why God would do it. Okay, that's it. That's all that's all the theist has to do. All the theist has to do is just look at the specific thing that exists and say, is this good, right, or not, right? And not, we'll get into the problem of evil in a moment because that's where tensions arise. Basically, all we have to do is identify that there's one specific, let's say it's consciousness, right? Well, if consciousness is a good thing, then that's the reason why God would allow it, right? And that's it. That's all the theist has to do. Now, again, this is, of course, abductive, right? So there is going to be some, it's not going to be like, okay, it's not going to be like, fine-tuning is like 100% evidence for theism. Like, no, it just means that this is some evidence for theism. I mean, we can identify that through the value mapping, right? As I would say. So it's just false. It's just this whole idea that we cannot test any theistic explanation. Again, all we have to do is identify within the object itself if there is some goodness to it. If there is, then that's a reason why God will bring it about, and that's all the theist has to do, right? So let me continue. If we did have an explanation for why God brought about one particular phenomena over another, then we would have to build in God's intentions, right? So we would have to posit the very things we're trying to explain. Of course, if we're doing this, this would decrease the probability of the hypothesis by us building in a particular divine intention to explain particular divine phenomena, right? Or any phenomena for that matter, right? But the problem here is that this is bad for any hypothesis because we are positing the very things we are trying to explain. And so I would say for this reason, right, for this reason alone, pretty much all abductive arguments for theism fail, because any phenomena that we can point to that says, okay, this is better explained by theism, well, we're going to have to posit a divine intention in order to explain that. But then we can't explain the intention because it's just a brute fact, right? So I would say, so again, this is, and again, I don't want to get too much into details on this because I'm going to do a whole video on this, right? This will be my next big Swinburne video. But basically, we don't need to build in a specific divine intention. All we have to do is look into the object, see, is there goodness to this object? And that's the reason why God would bring it about. That's it. That's all we have to do. You don't need to a priori derive, okay, God's going to like create like bunnies or cats or whatever. Right? That's not how we should look at this sort of thing, right? And so this whole idea that theism has bad explanatory power is pretty easy to counter when we take into account that theism's explanatory power is actually not in terms of God's power, but rather it's in terms of God's goodness. So if it's in terms of God's goodness, then that's going to, again, limit the amount of worlds or the kinds of things that God can create. So if theism predicts that God is going to create good things, then all you have to do is just link those good things to God's nature or explain those things in terms of God's nature. And that is it. We don't need to do anything else, right? When we're doing proper, when we're trying to like explain why God would create this thing rather than some other thing. Now, of course, you could ask the question, well, why would God create this one particular good thing and not some other particular good thing? And I would just say that that's irrelevant, because if we're doing proper Bayesian analysis correctly, all we have to do is just link the properties of goodness to God's nature, or the properties of the goodness of the object to God's nature. And that is it. And that's all you really need to do to make an abductive sort of argument, right, for theism. So this whole idea that, theism lacks explanatory power, the fundamental problem with this argument is that it is looking at theism's explanatory power in terms of God's power rather than in terms of God's goodness. So if theism's explanatory power is in terms of God's goodness, right, rather than his abilities, then we could do the value mapping, and then we could make some sort of abductive sort of case for theism, right, through that. So that's all I have to say on that, but that's the reason why this argument, at least right here, does not work, right? So I'm gonna now continue on with the final argument that I say. In that sort of account, it's really no abductive arguments for theism can really work. And then finally, I would argue that inscrutable evils makes theism highly improbable, right? So Robert Bass, he's a philosopher, he's argued that even with a prior probability of 99% for theism, inscrutable evils would outweigh any positive evidence for theism, given that theism is incompatible with gratuitous evils. And so just to give you a quote here, quote, "There is greater than a 95.8 chance that there is gratuitous evil, beginning with modest assumptions and a small number of inscrutable evils. For a world containing many inscrutable evils, the probability of gratuitous evils will be high, except where the prior probability of gratuitous evil is very low." Right? So the point here he wants to make here is that even if you basically build in all the evidence for theism and you give it like 99% probable that it's true, right, evil would just outweigh it, right, given the amount of inscrutable evils that we see in the world, right? And so I would argue that theism either falsifies, or inscrutable evils either falsifies theism, or it would make theism highly improbable, right? So premise 1, if God exists, there is no gratuitous evil. Premise 2, there is gratuitous evil. Conclusion, therefore God does not exist. So I would say that premise 2 can be replaced by 7, which is with high probability, 99.8%, there is gratuitous evil, conjoined with 1, that will yield, therefore, with high probability, God does not exist. And I would probably argue the same estimation that Robert Bass did, which is around 95%. So basically my point here is that even if the prior probability of theism was like 99%, evil would just outweigh all the evidence, basically, right? And again, we can go back and forth in the dialogue with that, but that would be my main argument. And then, all right, so let me go back to. Let me see here. Okay, there we go. All right, so this is an interesting sort of argument that I presented in my debate. This argument is from Robert Bass, of course, and he sort of made the argument that if you have a 99, so again, even if you build in all the evidence for theism, right, that evil is always going to sort of outweigh. And this is actually the reason why I use this paper. Just keep in mind here, the reason why I use this paper is this is what sort of started me, or at least this is what encouraged me to look more into the literature on the problem of evil. So I used this paper as like a way to sort of push the force, right? And that's why I like the argument. Now, of course, I don't agree with the argument, right? And I'll get into the reasons why, but that's the reason why I use it for the debate. Anyways, with that in mind, there is one fundamental problem, or at least one objection that I have to this argument that I presented. Let me stop sharing my screen real quick so that I can share the actual paper with you guys. Let me see here. Perfect. There we go. I don't know if you guys can see this. Hold on. Okay. I guess you can see some of it. I mean, I can't zoom in, unfortunately. But basically, so if you read the paper, I think it's page 121. It's kind of, 121, at least on the PDF file. He says, quote, that the fawn's suffering and death are necessary for some otherwise unattainable greater good seems impossible on the face of it. So this is the problem, okay? He is using the necessity condition to make this argument. What's the problem with this? Well, if a theist doesn't accept the necessity condition, that's it. The argument doesn't go through, right? In fact, if you watch my video on the problem of evil, so if you watch my video, I think it's called the explanatory flexibility of theism. I mentioned this at the very end. I mentioned the fact that this argument, and of course many others, but basically this argument assumes the necessity condition, right? In order to get off the ground. So in order to say that any sort of suffering is unjustified, right, you have to assume the necessity condition, right? The problem, of course, is if a theist rejects this condition, but rather he holds to what I call the defeat condition, the argument doesn't get off the ground, right? Because in that case, then you're going to have to make the argument that the fawn's suffering was undefeatable. And I'm not really sure how one could do that, right? And so with that in mind, I don't think this argument gets off the ground for the simple reason that it is assuming the necessity condition to even work, basically, right? And the moment that a theist presents the defeat condition when it comes to evil, again, see my video on the problem of evil, but basically, once you have the defeat condition, that's it. The argument doesn't work. It doesn't go through. It doesn't have any sort of evidential weight. And so that's my at least that's really my only objection to this argument. And I think that alone is sufficient to show that it doesn't work, basically. And so I just wanted to share my screen just to people to understand, like, Robert Bass, he uses the necessity condition to make this argument. So it's not going to be able to get off the ground if the theist does not accept that condition. Let me see. Oh, okay, there we go. All right. I think. All right, perfect. So yeah, that's really my only objection, that, well, I don't accept the necessity condition, so it's not going to work. Anyways, let's get to my final point on this. Premise 2 can be replaced by, 7, which is, with high probability, 99 superior to theism in every respect. So naturalism is simpler than theism, and it has okay, let me just a much higher probability than theism given our background knowledge, right? And of course, I'm doing worldview comparisons here. Furthermore, naturalism has superior explanatory power, given that its initial starting point is limited to natural possibilities and natural laws that govern in an evolving universe. On theism, however, it cannot tell you why you get one set of phenomena over another without building stuff into the hypothesis. I would also argue that theism has an advantage in regards to explain evil, right? Since on naturalism, there is no link between nature and values, and it is, because nature is indifferent to us, then I would argue that any evil that happens is far less surprising on naturalism than it is on theism. And finally, I would say that naturalism has an advantage when we look at specific facts of the world. So, for example, consciousness, morality, fine-tuning, and some of the arguments that Emerson brought up might be evidence for theism at first, but the problem is when we narrow down the facts about these things, right, they end up favoring naturalism. For example, consciousness is evidence for theism, but then when we look at the fact that consciousness depends on brains, that's evidence for naturalism. We look at moral or religious, widespread agreement, we could say, oh, well, that's evidence for theism, but then we look at disagreement, that would be evidence for naturalism, right? So any example of evidence for theism, when we zoom in, we realize, okay, this is actually evidence for naturalism, right? So that would be my sort of main point here in regards to why naturalism is superior. All right, so this is I would say this is actually my strongest sort of, at least the last one is my strongest argument. So I've already gone over the prior probability stuff earlier, which is it's just using the wrong view of simplicity, first of all, and it's looking at background knowledge the wrong way. So I would just push back against the first point that I make here. In regards to naturalism having superior explanatory power to theism, it really depends on your view of naturalism, right? So what I'm about to say here, I'm going to try to be as broad as I can, right? So typically, naturalism is paired with the hypothesis of a difference, okay? Which basically says that nature is indifferent towards us. Okay. All right, we that's fine. But the problem here is that when you have that sort of hypothesis, you're not going to be able to make any sort of predictions about values or good or bad states of affairs, right, on that. And so the only way that naturalism could actually have an advantage on this account is basically that theism makes false predictions. So basically, it's just less surprising. It's just less, it's more epistemically friendly that we would expect this on a sort of indifference hypothesis, right? And this is sort of the way that Paul Draper sort of argues, where we see evil. Okay, that's less surprising on naturalism. Therefore, it's evidence for naturalism in the sense that when we do these comparisons, that just seems to it seems that at least prima facie it seems that this would favor naturalism. Of course, the problem is what I mentioned, and this is going to hint at what I said earlier, which is the value mapping. Is that the moment that a theist can find a property of goodness or some sort of value relation between the object in question or the phenomena in question and God's nature, given God's goodness, that's a reason why God would bring it about, right? And so therefore, on that sort of, when you do that sort of value mapping, then the phenomena in question would either it would favor theism or it would actually just equal naturalism, right? In that sort of case. And of course, this is problematic because naturalism doesn't have a value mechanism. It cannot tell you why you have one state of affairs over another unless you build stuff in, right? So that's the only way you can really do it, is you have to build stuff in, or you could say, as Paul Draper would say, or you could say that it's just more epistemically friendly that you would expect this, right? And so the sort of way to look at this is the evidence for theism is basically going to boil down to, can the theist show that there is a link between God's goodness and his state of affairs? And then the evidence for naturalism is going to be, is there no link or no value mapping between whatever the indifference hypothesis says, because there's so many of them, but basically whatever the foundation of the naturalistic theory is, so whatever the naturalistic, the theoretical content of that hypothesis is, and then we get to some particular state of affairs, right? And the thing is, with that sort of view, if you cannot link it to goodness, then that would favor indifference. And in that sense, I agree, okay? If you're not able to make a link between goodness and some state of affairs, okay, that's evidence for indifference, right? And that's the way that Paul Draper does it. But of course, the problem is if the theist can make a link between God's nature and a state of affairs, right? If the theist can do that value mapping, then theism is automatically has the advantage here, right? And so that's the problem you're going to run into when it comes to at least this sort of claim that naturalism has an advantage in regards to explain evil, is that, again, if the theist can find a link between a bad state of affairs and God's nature, or at least why God would allow it. In other words, if a theist can present a theodicy, then that's it. Then the argument, at least the argument that naturalism has an advantage in regards to explain evil, doesn't work, because naturalism doesn't tell you anything about why there would be good or bad states of affairs. It has no upper or lower limit on good or bad states of affairs, right? Whereas theism does, right? So if theism has that upper or lower limit, then there's going to be a much more narrow range of worlds that can exist on theism, whereas on naturalism there seems to be a much wider range, right? And again, that's assuming you don't build anything in, so it actually gets much worse if the naturalist wants to build stuff into the hypothesis. Then it's actually going to really count against their hypothesis in that case. But anyways, so that's the first problem I want to point out with this argument. Now it gets a little more interesting with when you look at this through what I call Bayesian learning theory, right? And I will, again, this will be in my next video, so I don't want to get too much into the details here. But basically, one of the ways you could sort of look at least when it comes to theism explain evil, is that you do what's called the updating of priors, right? This is standard practice in Bayesian learning theory because, as many would say, and I think this is true, I mean, at least based on the research that I've done, Bayesian inference is actually a subset of learning theory, right? And so in that case, then you can update your priors, right? Whereas Paul Draper's account of this, he cannot update his priors. He doesn't look at it through Bayesian learning theory, right? I think I forgot exactly which view he holds to. I know there's like some formal name for it, but basically, the problem is that if you look at this through the Draperian route, right, you're not able to update your priors at all. So you're not able to take into account, or you're not able to observe data and then update your priors relative to that data, right? So your priors can never change on that sort of view. Whereas if you do hold to Bayesian learning theory, which I do, then you can update your priors, which means that you are able, once you identify some particular phenomena, once you can identify why that particular phenomena, why there's the properties of goodness in that phenomena, and once you can link that to God's nature, then all you have to do is update your priors, and that's it, right? And then the argument, and then in that case, then the argument, at least the Draperian style arguments from evil, don't go through, right? And that's it. That's all you have to do. Now, again, I will do a video on this, so I don't want to go too much into detail on this. This is pretty new stuff, even to me, okay? So I apologize if I cannot go into like super duper detail in regards to this, but that's what I will say for now. And then finally, in terms of the last point, which is that naturalism has an advantage when we look at specific facts. Again, I will keep repeating this. All we have to do is update the priors. So if we can identify why God would create embodied beings, as Swinburne would do, I think, and I myself, if you watch my video on the explanatory power of theism, I go over some of the reasons why God would create embodied beings and why it's a good thing that we are embodied. Then all you have to do is just identify that good thing and say, okay, this is the reason why God would allow it for it, and then update the priors, and that is it, right? That's all the theists have to do, right? Whereas if you're going to make the argument that, we would expect this on naturalism, okay, so you're not able to identify no link between God and why he would create this, thing or whatever. But again, the reason why I bring this up is because this is where I think the debates between theists and atheists needs to get more progress, right, in terms of these methodological issues, right? And so that's why I don't think these arguments work, right? And then, of course, finally, my final objection to at least the understated evidence thing that from Paul Draper, because this is from Paul Draper's stuff, but basically, in scientific practice, we don't talk about any sort of specific facts, right? We talk about general facts about, what are we to expect from general phenomena, right? And that, again, I don't want to get too much in detail here, but that's another, I guess, methodological issue that I have with this sort of argument, is that in scientific practice, we don't talk about specific facts. Like, for example, again, this is just one example. If we talk about Newton's theory of gravity, we don't say, okay, well, what caused that apple to drop? Okay, no, that's too specific. Or what causes apples to drop? No, that's too specific. But rather the question is, why do things attract with mass? That is the fundamental question we need to answer when it comes to science. And the same sort of, at least, methodological way of thinking also applies when we look at the evidence for and against theism, right? Is we have to look at the general facts. We cannot look at specifics, right? And so this is, I guess, a methodological issue that I have with this sort of objection, or the objection from the understated evidence one from Draper. So anyways, I'm almost at the hour mark, so I'm going to finish off my critique here. But yeah. So just given the final probability, number one, theism is less simple, right? So on global worldview comparison. Number two, theism is inconsistent with our background knowledge. And so because of these 2 points, it has a low prior probability. I would argue that theism has poor explanatory power, right? Given that we can't really explain why God does one action over another unless we build in God's intentions. And then finally, theism is incompatible with gratuitous evils, and there's a high probability that gratuitous evils actually exist, right? Thus, I would argue that theism has a 95% chance of being false, even with a prior probability of 99%. But of course, I don't think the prior probability is 99%, right? So when we actually look at the actual prior probability, which I would say is very low, right, it is more accurate to say that on total evidence, the total probability of theism is less than 1%. And thus, this gives atheism, inevitably, I would say, a 99% chance of being true. And so it is far more likely, given these facts, that God does not exist. All right, so that's my summary of my opening statement. If you haven't been watching, I will summarize briefly on my responses to this. So my response to 1 and 2 is that those are just the wrong way to view it. So number 1 is that the account, or at least the global worldview comparison account of simplicity that I use in this debate, and also I got it from Graham Oppie, so he's involved, this is where I got it from. It's just basically the wrong way to look at simplicity, right? This view of simplicity that I use in this debate does not exist in the philosophy of science. So that's the first problem, okay? The same sort of thing applies to my second point, which is that it's just the wrong way to look at background knowledge. So if we look at theism through a trope theoretic account, right? And if that sort of metaphysics is part of the background, then that's it. Then we could look at God through a trope, theoretic account, and theism would be consistent with background knowledge. And so in that case, then background knowledge would be consistent with theism, right? Given that God would be a sort of categoryless, in that sense, we're looking at theism through a categoryless ontology, right? For number 3, again, the explanatory power of theism is in terms of God's goodness, not in terms of his power, right? In terms of naturalism being superior, that only works if you cannot link the properties of goodness to God, because in that case, if you can't link it, then of course I would argue that indifference would be more likely. So naturalism would be more likely on that account. But again, if the theist can make a link between God's goodness and a state of affairs, the theism automatically has the advantage. So that pretty much pushes out point 3. And then of course point 4, which is gratuitous evil. I would recommend people see my video on the problem of evil, which is, I think, yeah. So my video is called The Explanatory Flexibility of Theism, right? And I give an account there. But basically, to summarize, the problem with this fourth argument is that it assumes the necessity condition, right? And if the theist does not include that within their axiology, then the argument doesn't get off the ground, right? And then, of course, once you have the defeat condition in mind, then then yeah, the probability space, or at least the probabilistic force of Robert Bass's argument is basically zero, because it's using a wrong criteria when assessing this. So yeah, that is my critique of my opening statement. Now, I know I have been. It's kind of my fault because I just got back from vacation, and so I apologize if I've been sort of like, how should I say? I apologize if I have been unorganized in my critique here, right? So, if you go back and you watch some of this stuff, there might be some times where I, go off the rails a little bit, but I will be doing a whole video, not on critiquing this, but rather I will be doing my next video on the Swinburne series is going to be going more into details on the things I have to say here, right? Because I think that when it comes to debate between theists and atheists, I think it's just a methodological debate. It's not actually really a debate about, whether God exists or not. I think it actually, like, fundamentally is just how should we even approach these sort of questions in the first place, right? And so that's all I have to say on that. And so, yeah, I hope you guys listen to what I have to say, and I hope that if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. My next videos are gonna be on the nature of heaven, hell, and sin. So I'm going to be doing more theological videos, at least the next few videos. And then I will eventually get back to Swinburne. But again, there's more research I have to do, especially in the philosophy of science. And the stuff I went over today is very, very brief on the literature. So yeah. Anyways, so thank you all for listening. Thank you all for watching. And this will be the end of my critique.